The house at number 42 was a lung, huffing out the stale breath of old newspapers and the sweet rot, scented memory of summer peaches, a great Victorian beast that stood on the edge of the town like a discarded tooth. Adam Robinson sat in the belly of this whale, surrounded by the tick of 1,000 clocks that didn't to tell time so much as they measured the erosion of his own skin. He was a man made of ink and parchment, his fingers stained with the soot of 1,000,000 forgotten headlines. And as he sat there, the computer screen before him flickered with the frantic heartbeat of an electric pulse. It was a green glare world, a digital swamp where the data swam like bioluminescent fish. Then the text appeared, stark and jagged as a lightning strike across a midnight sky. Source Informant. Adam felt his pulse jump, a frantic rabbit beneath the cage of his ribs. The message was a single, devastating line that smelled of ozone and wet pavement. It identified the predator, the thing that had been carving a red path through the neighboring counties, a creature of steel and malice known to the digital underground as the target, Whisperer. Barnaby the cat. Was a splash of ginger marmalade across the rug, a coil of orange smoke that suddenly solidified into a statue of feline suspicion. His ears swiveled like radar dishes, catching a sound that Adam's duller human ears could yet process. A sound like a razor blade being drawn across a silk ribbon. The air in the room suddenly felt vacant, as if the oxygen had been sucked out by a giant, invisible vacuum, leaving behind a hollow space where safety used to dwell. Adam stood, his knees popping like dry kindling. He looked at the window, where the evening was a bruised purple, the color of a fresh hematoma. He wasn't teat alone. He knew it because the house told him so. The floorboards groaned under a weight that didn't belong to the wind, a rhythmic, heavy tread that spoke of boots made of iron and intentions made of broken glass. The Whisperer was not just a name on a screen anymore. He was a physical gravity, a black hole approaching the front porch, pulling the light and the hope out of the hallway. The front door didn't just open, it exhaled. It swung wide on hinges that screamed like a choir of rusted angels, admitting a figure that was less a man and more a collection of sharp angles and starlight, glinting edges. The slasher stood in the frame, a silhouette cut from the fabric of a nightmare with a pair of tailor as shears. He didn't have a face so much as a mask of polished chrome that reflected Adam's own terror back at him in a funhouse distortion. In his right hand, he held a blade that was 3 feet of frozen mercury, a long, thin needle of a sword that looked as if it could stitch the wind to the floor. Barnaby hissed, a sound of boiling water and sandpaper before vanishing into the shadows of the bookshelf like a ghost retreating into a library. Adam backed away, his hands fumbling for the brass letter opener on his desk, a pathetic splinter of metal against the tectonic plate of violence that had just entered his sanctuary. The intruder moved with a terrifying mechanical grace, his boots clicking on the hardwood with the precision of a metronome. Every step the Whisperer took seemed to rewrite the geography of the room. The distance between them didn't shrink. It folded, the space collapsing like a cardboard box in the rain. Adam swung the letter opener, a desperate, sweeping arc that met only the thin, biting air. The slasher didn't dodge. He simply wasn't there, a blur of motion that reappeared 3 feet to the left, his chrome mask catching the flickering light of the computer screen. The blade in his hand hissed as it cut through the atmosphere, a sound like a snake dreaming of a kill. It caught the sleeve of Adam's corduroy jacket, parting the fabric with a surgical indifference, leaving a thin red line on his forearm that began to weep the color of a sunset. The pain wasn't immediate. It was a slow, blooming heat, a radiator turning on in the middle of a blizzard. Adam scrambled backward, tripping over a stack of encyclopedias, his world tilting until the ceiling was the floor and the walls were a spinning carousel of terror. He crawled toward the kitchen, his breath coming in short, jagged gasps that tasted of copper and panic. The Whisperer followed, not running but walking with the inevitable pace of a clock toward midnight. The slasher's blade tapped against the doorframe. Clink, 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 a silver fingernail rapping on the casket of the world. Adam reached for the heavy iron skillet on the stove, his fingers trembling like leaves in an October gale. He felt the heat of the man behind him, a dry desert heat that smelled of scorched oil and old coins. He turned, swinging the skillet with every ounce of his adrenaline-fueled strength. But the Whisperer caught it. The gloved hand of the killer was a vice of leather and bone, stopping the heavy iron as if it were a falling feather. The chrome mask tilted, reflecting the stove's pilot light like a singular burning eye. Then, with a flick of his wrist, The slasher sent the skillet flying into the pantry, where it shattered a dozen jars of preserved peaches in a spray of glass and syrup. Adam was pinned against the refrigerator, the hum of the appliance vibrating through his spine like a low-voltage execution. The Whisperer leaned in, the tip of the long blade resting just beneath Adam's chin, a cold promise of a second mouth. The cat, Barnaby, reappeared on top of the fridge, a shadow among shadows, his yellow eyes glowing like twin embers in a dying fire. The cat didn't move to help. He watched with the ancient, detached curiosity of a sphinx observing the fall of an empire. The slasher began to lean his weight into the blade, the metal biting into the soft skin of Adamus' neck, a silver needle poised to thread the needle of his life. Outside, the trees thrashed against the siding of the house at number 42, their branches like the frantic fingers of a man trying to claw his way out of a grave. The world was nothing but the smell of peaches, the hum of the fridge, and the glint of the chrome mask as the Whisperer prepared to speak his final silent word. The blade was a cold thought beneath his chin, a silver razor, logic that carved the silence into two bleeding halves. Adam Robinson did not breathe. He became a statue of salt and electricity, his eyes locked onto the chrome curvature of the slasher, a mask where his own terrified face was stretched into a balloon of white meat. The Whisperer did not lean. He tilted, a mechanical sunflower following a dark sun, and the air between them hummed with the high-frequency whine of a television left on a dead channel. Then the ginger marmalade of Barnaby the cat erupted. The feline didn't leap so much as he became a firework of fur and claws, a golden projectile that collided with the slasher's shoulder. It was the friction of a small, warm life against a great, cold machine. In that frantic tick of the clock, Adam drove his thumb upward, not into an eye, but into the mesh, grill of the mask, socket. There was no wetness of an eyeball, only the sharp, stinging vibration of a radio. Tower at midnight, a jolt of static that traveled up Adam's arm like a swarm of angry hornets. The slasher recoiled, his boots making the sound of a meat. Cleaver hitting a marble slab, and Adam rolled, his body a frantic sack of bones, spilling across the linoleum and into the charcoal, shadowed throat of the hallway. He ran, and the house ran with him, the hallway stretching out like a rubber band made of cedar and velvet. The slasher's movement was a series of missing frames in a film reel. One moment he was by the refrigerator, the next he was at the mouth of the hall, his chrome head flickering beneath the dying amber of the overhead light. It was a stutter, step in reality, a jump cut in the physics of the evening. Adam's heart was a frantic bird trapped in a chimney, beating its wings against the soot of his ribs. He reached the heavy oak door of the study and slammed it, the brass bolt sliding home with the finality of a coffin lid. Behind him, the wood didn't groan. It whispered. The slasher was on the other side, and he wasn't tote knocking. He was drawing his blade across the grain of the door, a sound like a giant's fingernail tracing the map of Adam's eventual demise. The ginger cat Barnaby was already there, pacing the perimeter of a Persian rug, his tail a twitching orange question mark in the dark. The room smelled of mothballs and the dry pepper. Sting of old books, thousands of them, their spines like the ribs of a great leather-bound whale. Adam fumbled for the desk lamp, but the light that bloomed was not yellow. It was a bruised electric blue that made the ink on his fingers look like oil. He remembered the message. Source, Informant. His grandfather had been a man of wires and hidden frequencies, a ham radio enthusiast who listened to the voices of the stars until his ears turned to wax. Adam lunged for the bottom drawer, the wood shrieking a protest of dry rot. Inside lay a reel tape recorder, its twin spindles looking like the eyes of a blind mechanical owl. He slapped a tape onto the hub, his fingers slick with the iron, scented sweat of the hunt. Outside, the door began to part, not in splinters, but in clean, surgical ribbons, as if the slasher were peeling a silver orange. The blade poked through, a needle of mercury searching for the heat of a throat. Adam hit play. The tape hissed, a sound like 1,000 cicadas dying in a summer field. Then a voice emerged, thin and brittle as a pressed flower. The voice of a man who had been dead since the leaves fell in 1954. It was his grandfather, and the words were a rhythmic chant of numbers and locations, a geography of the hidden. The Whisperer is the broadcast. The voice crackled, and the broadcast is the man. He is the static in the bone, the hum in the marrow, the thing that happens when the signal finds a vacant heart to call home. The slasher stopped. The ribbons of wood ceased their curling. The chrome mask appeared in the gap of the door. tilted at a 45-degree angle, the blue light of the study dancing across its surface like a school of neon fish. The killer seemed to be listening, his body vibrating in sync with the hiss of the tape, a tuning fork of violence catching the frequency of its own origin. The air in the study thickened, turning into a soup of dust and magnetic tape. Adam watched as the slasher, his gloved hand reached through the ruined door, the fingers long and spindly as the legs of a harvestman's spider. The hand didn't grab, it gestured, a slow hypnotic wave that seemed to pull the very breath from Adam. The cat, Barnaby, let out a low, guttural moan that sounded like a human name spoken underwater. The wallpaper began to ripple, the floral patterns of roses and ivy twisting into the shapes of listening ears and wide, unblinking eyes. The house was no longer a shelter. It was a sensory organ, a giant ear pressed against the chest of the universe, and the slasher was the needle dropping into the groove of a jagged, black record. Adam realized then that the target whisperer wasn't just a name for a killer, it was a description of a function. The man in the chrome mask was a receiver, and he was currently tuned to the frequency of Adam, his own terror. The tape reached its end. The plastic ribbon flapping against the spindle with a rhythmic slap. Slap that echoed the frantic pace of a dying pulse. In the sudden vacuum of sound, the slasher spoke. It wasn't a voice from a throat. It was a sound that came from the walls, the floorboards, and the very marrow of Adam's teeth. It was the sound of 1,000 dry leaves being crushed by a velvet boot. Adam, the house said. Adam, the informant has given us your name, and your name is a beautiful, red song. The door didn't give way. It dissolved, the wood turning into a fine brown powder that coated the air like cinnamon. The slasher stepped into the room, his blade held high, a silver lightning rod ready to catch the storm of Adam's life. Barnaby hissed, a spray of feline defiance as the killer began to move, not toward Adam, but toward the window, where the night was a vast, black mouth waiting to swallow the world whole. The hunt had changed. It was no longer a pursuit of flesh, but a symphony of the grotesque, and the first movement was just beginning. The window didn't shatter so much as it decided to stop being a solid, becoming instead a cloud of frozen dragonflies that hummed with the vibration of 1 billion lost radio signals. Adam Robinson watched, his heart a frantic pendulum in a clock made of ice, as the slasher stepped through the jagged frame and out into a night that had forgotten how to be a night. There was no lawn outside, no street lamps, no sleeping suburbia. There was only a vast, indigo sea of unspooled magnetic tape, a desert of rustling celluloid that stretched toward a horizon made of static. The whisperer didn't fall. He walked upon the shimmering ribbons of film, his chrome mask reflecting a sky that was a giant cracked television screen showing a test pattern of grey and white. Barnaby the cat was a streak of orange lightning, leaping from the windowsill and landing with a soft, velvet thud upon the shifting floor of the world. Hucking in his navel, a psychic fishhook that dragged him toward the breach, his feet moving with a clockwork autonomy that ignored the frantic protests of his mind. He tumbled through the window and found himself standing in a town that was a charcoal sketch of his own memories, a place where the houses were made of stiffened laundry and the trees were skeletons of wire and burnt matches. The slasher was ahead of him, a silver needle stitching a path through this landscape of soot and smudge. Every time the killer's long blade swung, he didn't just cut the air, he pruned the reality of the town. He sliced a telephone pole, and the wires didn't snap. They bled black ink that smelled of old libraries and burnt rubber. He cut the corner of a phantom bakery, and the air was suddenly filled with the scent of flour and the screams of 1,000 unbaked loaves. Adam stumbled after him, his boots crunching on a ground that felt like dried cicada shells. He looked down at his arm where the previous cut had been and saw that the wound wasn't bleeding red anymore. It was leaking a pale, flickering light, the color of a firefly's belly just before it dies. Stop! Adam's voice was a dry rattle of pebbles in a tin can. The whisperer turned, his chrome mask catching the flickering test. Pattern sky, and for a moment the reflection showed not Adam, but a younger version of himself, a boy of 10 holding a jar of captured summer light. The slasher. Splade hissed, a silver snake whispering of the end of all things, and then the killer struck out at a nearby oak tree that was made of old yellowed newspapers. The tree fell with a sound of 1 billion pages turning at once, and from its hollow trunk spilled a swarm of black, ink birds that circled Adam's head, their wings flapping with the sound of a typewriter, as carriage return. The informant, that digital ghost from the screen, seemed to be everywhere now. In the ink of the birds, in the rustle of the tape, deck desert, in the very gravity that pulled Adam toward the center of this collapsing dream. He realized with a jolt of lightning, bolt clarity, that the town was being erased, one memory at a time, and the slasher was the eraser, a tool of precision and chrome. Barnaby hissed, his fur standing up like 1,000 orange needles, as a house that looked suspiciously like Adam's childhood home began to dissolve into a flurry of white moths. The slasher moved toward it, his boots clicking with the rhythm of a metronome that was slowly, inexorably speeding up. Adam lunged forward, his hands grasping for a handful of the celluloid desert, trying to anchor himself to something, anything, that felt like the solid earth of 5 minutes ago. His fingers found a length of tape that felt warm, a memory of a birthday cake and the smell of blown-out candles, and he pulled. The world buckled. The indigo sea of tape rose up in a tidal wave of hiss and crackle, and for a heartbeat, Adam saw the face of the informant behind the slasher. Smask, it was a face made of glowing vacuum tubes and copper wire, a face that smiled with a mouth of jagged glass. The slasher swung his blade in a wide, shimmering arc that cut the horizon itself. The sky bled a deep, bruised violet, and the test pattern shattered into a million tiny squares of multicolored light. Adam felt a searing heat across his chest, a line of fire that tasted like a rusted nail held against the tongue. He didn't fall, but his perspective shifted, the world turning 90 degrees until he was standing on the side of a building made of wet cardboard. Gravity was a suggestion, a fading law in a land of outlaws. The Whisperer was suddenly above him, or perhaps below him, the long blade poised like a conductor. His baton, the killer, began to hum, a sound that wasn't heat or melody, but a vibration that made Adam's very bones feel as if they were turning into tuning forks. It was the sound of the broadcast, the high-frequency scream of a universe that was being turned off. One star at a time, Barnaby darted between the slasher, as legs a blur of marmalade defiance, and the killer paused. In that hesitation, Adam saw a cellar door standing alone in the middle of the desert of tape, a wooden hatch that looked solid and heavy and real. It was the only thing in this abstract nightmare that had a shadow, a deep, velvet, black shape that anchored it to the shimmering floor. He scrambled toward it, his limbs feeling like heavy pistons, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts that tasted of ozone and dry rot. The slasher turned, his chrome mask a blank mirror, and began to glide toward him, the silver blade trailing behind him like the tail of a comet. The hum increased in volume, a roar of static that threatened to drown out the very concept of Adam Robinson. He reached the cellar door and gripped the iron ring, the metal biting into his palm with a wonderful, painful reality. He pulled, and the door didn't open onto a basement. It opened onto a void that smelled of damp earth, and the basement of the world where the gears of the universe were kept. He plunged inside, the cat a warm weight against his ankle, just as the slasher's blade carved a sliver of wood from the hatch. The world above, the tape, desert, the newspaper trees, the test, pattern sky, vanished with the sound of a television being clicked into the dark. Adam fell through a throat of shadows, a long vertical hallway where the walls were lined with the ticking hearts of 1,000,000 clocks, all of them synchronized to the beating of his own frantic pulse. He was in the basement of the house at number 42, but the house was now a cathedral of gears, and the slasher was the janitor coming to wind the springs of his death. The basement was a lung of brass and oil, breathing out the rhythmic clatter of 1,000,000,000,000 metal teeth that gnashed at the very concept of time. Adam Robinson landed on a floor that wasn't stone or wood, but a vibrating carpet of interlocking cogs, a clockwork ocean that threatened to grind his soles into a fine, leathery dust. Above, the hatch he had fallen through was a dwindling square of violet light, a postage stamp of a world he no longer inhabited, and then it was gone, snuffed out by the chrome, plated arrival of the slasher. The Whisperer didn't descend. He drifted down like a flake of silver soot, his long mercury, needle blade held horizontal, a balancing pole for a tightrope walker over the abyss of the house, inner workings. Barnaby the cat was a spark of orange electricity dancing between the spinning gears, his paws finding purchase on the moving brass with a grace that mocked Adam's frantic, slipping stumble. The air here tasted of scorched lubricants and the ozone of 1,000 lightning strikes caught in a bottle. The machinery wasn't just turning. It was thinking, a mechanical brain the size of a cathedral, and as Adam scrambled deeper into the gut of the house, he saw the walls were lined with shelves of glass jars, each one glowing with a faint phosphor, green luminescence. He paused, his breath a jagged saw in his throat, and looked closer at the nearest vessel. Inside, a human tongue floated in a brine of starlight, its tip twitching as if it were still trying to finish a sentence, started 50 years ago. These were the harvests of the Informant, the vocal cords and linguistic scrap. Metal of those who had been silenced by the chrome needle. Thousands of jars, a library of stolen breaths, a museum of the unsaid. The slasher, whose boots made a sound like a hammer hitting a velvet anvil as he stepped onto the gear. Train behind Adam, the vibration traveling through the soles of Adam, shoes, and up into his shins like a swarm of microscopic, stinging ants. The killer, some mask reflected the green jars, turning his head into a glowing emerald skull that lacked the decency of eyes. With a flick of his wrist, the Whisperer sent his blade whistling through the air, not at Adam, but at the shelves. The glass shattered in a symphonic explosion of chime and discord, and the tongues fell like wet slugs onto the moving gears. Suddenly, the basement was no longer silent. It was a cacophony of 1,000 overlapping voices, a scream of 1,000,000 half-finished words that rose up like a physical wall of sound. Help! Tomorrow the sun is... Don't to look at... The noise was a bludgeon, a heavy, invisible weight that pressed against Adam, as eardrums until he felt the delicate membranes might pop like soap bubbles in a gale. He fell to his knees, his hands clamped over his ears, but the voices didn't come from the air. They came from the floor, the gears themselves speaking the stolen memories as they crushed the tongues into a red, electric pulp. The slasher waded through the noise as if it were a gentle stream, his chrome mask unmoving, his blade now dripping with the emerald brine of the jars. Barnaby leaped onto Adam's shoulder, his claws digging through the corduroy and into the meat of Adam's skin, a sharp, grounding pain that cut through the fog of the vocal storm. The cat, as tail lashed against Adam, as cheek pointing toward a vent where a plume of white steam hissed like a cornered viper. It was a throat of galvanized steel, a way out or perhaps a way deeper into the digestive tract of the house. Adam lunged for it, his fingers slipping on the gore, slicked brass of the cogs, his body a clumsy machine of bone and panic. He shoved himself into the vent, the metal hot against his ribs, the smell of boiling water and old copper coins filling his nostrils. Behind him, the slasher didn't hurry. He simply reached out and caught Adam's shadow. The long blade didn't pierce Adam's flesh. It pinned the dark shape of his silhouette to the gear, wall a silver nail through the ghost of his presence. The physical jerk was tectonic. Adam's body slammed against the interior of the steam pipe, his soul feeling as if it were being peeled away from his skin like a wet decal. He was anchored, a kite tied to a hurricane, his shadow trapped in the teeth of the basement, clockwork while his flesh tried to flee. The Whisperer stood over the pinned shadow, the tip of his blade vibrating with the frequency of the house, his heartbeat. He began to twist the blade, and in the steam pipe, Adam felt his own ribs begin to spiral, a slow, agonizing torque that threatened to turn his skeleton into a corkscrew. The cat, Barnaby, let out a yowl that was a jagged tear in the fabric of the noise, and he began to bat at the pinned shadow, his orange paws moving with a frantic, blurring speed. Each strike of the cat's claws on the shadow felt like a spark of static on Adam's back, a series of micro-shocks that began to fray the connection between the man and his silhouette. The steam in the pipe suddenly turned from white to a deep, bruised indigo, the color of a storm, cloud at midnight. Adam felt the pipe begin to expand, the metal softening until it felt like the throat of a great, warm animal. He was being swallowed, pulled upward by a suction that tasted of peppermint and old postage stamps below. The slasher looked up, his chrome mask catching the indigo light, and for the first time, a sound escaped him. It wasn't he to whisper. It was the sound of a clock. A mainspring snapping, a violent metallic twang that shook the very foundations of the house at number 42. The blade remained in the shadow, but the shadow was no longer Adam, as it had been replaced by the orange, flickering shape of a cat. Barnaby had traded his own silhouette for Adam, as a feline sacrifice in the gut of the machine. Adam was launched upward through the indigo throat, his body feeling light as a dandelion seed, leaving his ginger companion and his own dark double in the clutches of the Whisperer. He burst through a floor of soft white carnations, finding himself in the attic, where the air was still and the only sound was the weeping of 1,000 unlit candles. The attic was a forest of white wax, a graveyard of unlit intentions where the air smelled of moth, eaten summers and the dry, brittle laughter of grandmothers long since turned to dust. Adam Robinson stood amidst the 10,000 tapers, his breath a ghost that refused to leave the haunted house of his lungs, his heart a muffled drum buried deep in a chest of cedar and old lace. He looked at his feet, where the white carnations were already beginning to brown and curl, turning into the parched skin of ancient mummies beneath his weight. The house at number 42 had become a cathedral of the forgotten, a place where the attic did just hold old trunks, but held the very seasons of a man's life, stacked and labeled and left to rot. He thought of Barnaby, the orange, marmalade cat, who was now a shadow, less prisoner in the clockwork basement, and the thought was a splinter of ice driven into the soft meat of his soul. Then, without a match, without a spark, the first candle ignited, a tiny blue eye of flame that looked at Adam with a terrible flickering recognition. One by one, the forest of wax began to wake, a slow-motion sunrise of chemical fire that turned the attic into a shimmering golden oven. The heat didn't rise. It drifted like a yellow fog, carrying with it the scent of burning honey and the sharp metallic tang of a copper penny held against the tongue. And then the floorboards began to bleed not blood, but a thick silver mercury that pooled around the base of the candles. From this quicksilver lake the slasher emerged, his chrome mask reflecting the 10,000 flames until he looked like a man made of suns. He didn't rise with effort. He was a bubble of lethal geometry floating to the surface of a dream. The Whisperer stood among the candles, his long needle, blade held aloft, catching the light and throwing a jagged silver spear across the rafters. The silence was no longer a void. It was a vacant space waiting to be filled with the sound of a scream that tasted like sun-bleached bone. Adam backed away, his heels clicking against a heavy iron-bound trunk that sat in the corner like a brooding gargoyle. On its lid, carved in a script that looked like the tracks of a frantic bird, were the word source, Informant. He threw the lid open, and instead of mothballs or old photos, he found a pile of discarded human ears, thousands of them, dried and brittle as autumn leaves. They were the listeners, the ones who had heard the broadcast and been harvested for their attention. Among the ears lay a small, brass telegraph key, its handle worn smooth by the touch of 1,000 nervous fingers. As the slasher glided closer, his boots making a sound like wet parchment tearing, the telegraph key began to click of its own accord. It wasn't Morse code. It was the staccato heartbeat of the house itself, a rhythmic throb that pulsed in the marrow of Adam's teeth. The message on the trunk flared with a sudden internal light, the ink turning into a liquid fire that scorched the air. The Whisperer paused, his chrome head tilting as he listened to the telegraph's frantic chatter. The blade in his hand began to glow with a pale, jaundiced light, the color of a bruise that refused to heal. He wasn't looking for Adam's throat anymore. He was looking for the source of the signal, the target Whisperer, finding its own echo in the room of candles. Adam grabbed the telegraph key, the metal searing his palm, and he felt a sudden violent connection to the basement gears, to the tape, desert, and to the orange cat who was still fighting in the dark. He wasn't just a victim. He was a conductor, a lightning rod for the static that the slasher called home. He hammered the key, his rhythm a chaotic, jazz, drumming of defiance, and the candles responded. They didn't flicker. They roared, their flames stretching upward until they touched the roof, turning the attic into a chimney of golden light. The slasher lunged, his blade a silver streak that cut through the heat like a hot wire through wax. Adam dived behind the trunk of ears, the smell of ancient hearing filling his senses, a dry, dusty odor that spoke of secrets kept too long. The blade struck the iron banding of the trunk, and the sound wasn't a metallic clang, but a human cry, a high-pitched note of agony that made the candles shudder. The Whisperer's chrome mask cracked, a single black fissure appearing down the center like a frozen lightning bolt. From the crack emerged a sound that Adam recognized. The sound of his own voice, recorded and played back at half speed, a slow, deep rumble that said, "Why did you leave the door unlocked, Adam?" The slasher was no longer just a killer. He was a mirror of Adam, his own negligence, a personification of the things he had left unsaid and the doors he had failed to bolt. The attic began to tilt, the geometry of the room collapsing into a funnel of flame and shadow. Adam scrambled toward the small circular window at the peak of the gable, his fingers clawing at the hot wood of the rafters behind him. The slasher was a whirlwind of chrome and fire, his long blade spinning like the propeller of a crashed airplane. The trunk of ears exploded, the dried lobes flying through the air like a storm of brown butterflies, each one whispering a different name into the heat. Adam reached the window and shattered the glass with the telegraph key, the shards falling outward like diamonds into the black velvet of the night. He didn't jump. He was exhaled, the pressure of the burning attic spitting him out into the cold, crisp air of October. He fell, but the ground didn't rush up to meet him. Instead, he found himself sliding down the long, shingled neck of the house at number 42, his body a frantic marble on a roof made of slate and moonlight. He landed in the gutters, the copper cold against his ribs, and looked back up at the attic window. The slasher stood there, a silhouette of silver framed by the golden roar of the candles, his mask still cracked, his blade still searching. But the killer didn't follow. He turned back into the fire, his body dissolving into a swarm of glowing sparks that looked like a constellation falling to earth. Adam realized then that the attic was a furnace for the soul, a place where the memories were burned to provide the power for the house's terrible, ticking heart. He crawled along the gutter, his fingers numbing until he reached the edge of the roof and looked down. Below him, the town was gone, replaced by a vast swirling nebula of ink and static, a sea of unwritten stories where the only landmark was the glowing, ember-red eyes of a cat waiting in the porch, light of a house that no longer existed. He was a man on a roof in the middle of a void, and the broadcast was just reaching its crescendo. The shingles beneath him began to turn into the keys of a giant typewriter, each one depressing with a heavy metallic thud as he crawled. He was writing his own escape, his movements a frantic prose of survival across the skin of the architecture. The smell of the attic fire followed him, a scent of toasted marshmallows and funeral pyres, a sweet, cloying odor that clung to his hair and clothes. He looked at his hands and saw they were no longer flesh. They were made of the same yellowed newsprint as the trees in the tape. Desert, his veins a network of black ink and frantic headlines. He was becoming part of the story, a character in the Informant, as Ledger. A name to be whispered by the slasher in the dark. He reached the chimney, a soot, stained finger pointing at the stars, and clung to it as the house began to spin, a carousel of wood and glass lost in the vacant reaches of a forgotten galaxy. The chimney began to crumble, the bricks turning into red, dusty books that fell away into the abyss. Adam held on to the last remaining volume, a heavy tome with a spine made of sun, bleached bone. He opened it, and the pages were blank, except for a single line of text that appeared in real time as he watched. Adam Robinson reached the end of the roof and found the beginning of the knife. He looked up, and there, standing on the very tip of the chimney, was the slasher. His blade pointed directly at Adam's heart, the chrome mask reflecting the end of the world. The cat's eyes below flared with a sudden blinding brilliance, and for a moment the house was a lighthouse in the dark, a beacon of terror signaling to a shore that had long ago washed away. Adam Robinson closed his eyes and let go of the book, falling into the white, silent space between the words. The fall was a slow, motion descent through a paper shredder of a universe where the air was made of confetti and the ground was a rumor whispered by a dying ghost. Adam Robinson tumbled through a white, out of unpunctuated space, his limbs flailing like the broken spokes of an umbrella tossed into a hurricane. He drifted past a floating door numbered 42, a rectangle of oak that whipped amber sap and hissed with the sound of 1,000 needles skipping on a vinyl record. There was no gravity here, only the magnetic pull of a story that refused to end, a narrative current that dragged him toward a horizon that was a vacant line drawn by a trembling ink-stained hand. He felt his skin becoming porous, the texture of his hands shifting from warm flesh to the cool, dry grain of a high-quality bond paper, his veins now thin blue lines of cursive script. He wasn't just falling, he was being read, his life a series of sentences being devoured by the hungry eyes of the void. He landed with the sound of a book being slammed shut, finding himself in a town that was a flattened, two-dimensional charcoal sketch of his own childhood. The houses were cardboard cutouts held up by wooden stakes, and the sky was a grey wash of watercolor that smelled of wet graphite and library paste. Adam stood, his body feeling thin and fragile, as if a stiff breeze might fold him into a paper crane. Behind him, the slasher emerged from a puddle of black ink, his chrome mask now a jagged mirror that reflected the flat, grey world in 1,000 sharp-edged diamonds. The Whisperer didn't T-walk. He slid across the landscape like a razor blade across a map, his boots making a sound like a metal comb being dragged through dry hair. The long needle of his blade was a silver stylus, and as he moved he began to edit the world, slicing through the cardboard houses and leaving behind ribbons of dark, curling smoke. The landscape did just break, it bled. When the slasher's blade cut through a two-dimensional oak tree, the air was filled with the scent of sawdust and old, burnt coffee. Adam ran, his feet making the soft, rhythmic thud of a rubber stamp against a desk. He looked for a place to hide, But the town was a facade, a movie set built of lies and charcoal. He ducked behind a flat, wooden fence, and as he did, a flash of orange, marmalade light caught his eye. Barnaby the cat was perched atop a chimney that was nothing more than a painted line, his fur glowing with a fierce internal fire that made the grey world tremble. The cat's eyes were no longer yellow. They were twin emerald screens flickering with the green scrolling text of the source, Informant. Barnaby opened his mouth, and instead of a meow, the sound of a high-speed telegraph erupted, a staccato burst of information that vibrated in Adam's very marrow. The message was clear, a pulse of electric certainty in a world of paper. The target whisperer was not the killer, but the broadcast itself, and Adam was the antenna. The slasher was merely the technician, the one sent to trim the wires and sharpen the signal. As the realization hit him, the fence behind Adam was sliced in half, the wood turning into a flurry of black moths that dissolved into the grey sky. The whisperer stood there, his chrome mask tilted, his blade held low like a surgeon, scalpel. He wasn't looking for Adam's heart. He was looking for the blue lines of script on his arms, the story that was written in his blood. The killer lunged, a blur of silver and shadow, and the blade caught the edge of Adam's shoulder. It didn't feel like a cut. It felt like a sentence being deleted, a sudden cold gap in his memory where the knowledge of his mother's face used to be. Adam screamed, but the sound was a puff of black soot that drifted away on the wind. He scrambled back, his hands fumbling for something solid, and his fingers brushed against the cat. Barnaby was warm, a singular point of heat in the charcoal town, and as Adam touched him, the green text from the cat eye's highs flowed into his own skin. The source wasn't a person. It was a reservoir of all the things the house at number 42 had ever heard, a digital ocean of secrets that now surged through Adam. Veins like liquid lightning. He felt his body thicken, the paper skin turning back into flesh that tasted of iron and salt. He wasn't just a character anymore. He was becoming the author, his fingers tingling with the power to rewrite the grey, flat world. The slasher paused, his chrome mask flickering with static, his blade vibrating with a high-pitched whine of confusion. The whisperer lunged again. But this time Adam didn't run. He reached out and grabbed the silver blade with his bare hand, the metal biting into his palm. But instead of blood, a stream of glowing green code erupted from the wound, wrapping around the blade like a nest of electric snakes. The slasher tried to pull back, but the code was a cage, a digital tether that linked the killer to the source of the broadcast. The chrome mask began to melt, the polished surface turning into a stream of silver tears that revealed a face made of flickering vacuum tubes and copper mesh. This was the true face of the Whisperer, not a man, but a receiver, a hollow vessel for the static of the universe. The hum in the air grew to a deafening roar, a symphony of 1 billion radio stations all playing at once, and the paper town began to curl at the edges, caught in the heat of the digital fire. Barnaby leaped from the chimney and landed on the slasher's shoulder, his claws digging into the copper mesh and sending a shower of blue sparks into the grey sky. The cat was a conduit, a grounding wire for the storm of information that Adam was unleashing. The slasher's body began to fragment, his limbs turning into blocks of pixelated shadow that drifted away like ash. The long blade shattered into 1,000 glass needles, each one reflecting a different moment from Adam's life, his first steps, his grandfather's radio, the smell of peaches in the house at number 42. The world was no longer flat. It was a kaleidoscope of light and sound, a swirling vortex of memories and data that threatened to pull Adam into its center. He held onto the cat, the only real thing in a universe of ghosts, as the charcoal town dissolved into a sea of white light. The light was a physical pressure, a heavy, warm blanket that smelled of sun, bleached bone, and old, dry parchment. Adam felt himself being pulled through a needle. A sigh of reality, his body stretching and thinning until he was nothing but a single, golden thread of light. He saw the slasher one last time, a fading silhouette of chrome and copper, his mask finally shattering to reveal a pair of eyes that were as vacant as the sky on a winter morning. Then the slasher was gone, replaced by a silence that was so deep it felt like a physical weight against his chest. Adam wasn't in the town anymore, and he wasn't in the house. He was standing in the middle of a vast, infinite library where the shelves were made of starlight, and the books were bound in the skin of the universe. He looked down at his hand and saw the green code still pulsing beneath his skin, a secret language that only he could read. Barnaby sat at his feet, his orange fur glowing with a soft, steady light, his eyes back to their natural, curious yellow. The cat looked up at a high, arched window where a single silver moon hung like a polished coin. It wasn't T the moon from the world of paper, and it wasn't Teeth the moon from the house at number 42. It was a new moon, a moon that smelled of fresh ink and the first frost of a long, dark winter. Adam reached for a book on the nearest shelf, a heavy volume with his own name embossed on the spine in gold leaf. He opened it, and the first 5 chapters were already written, the ink still wet and gleaming in the starlight. He turned to the 6th chapter, but the pages were blank, a vast white desert waiting for the first footstep. He looked at the cat, and then at the window, and he knew that the whisperer was still out there, hiding in the static between the words, waiting for the next broadcast to begin. The library was a graveyard of silent thunder, where every book was a heart that had stopped beating, but hadn't quite realized it yet. Adam Robinson walked through the aisles of starlight. Soaked mahogany, his feet making no sound on the floor of compressed memories, his fingers trailing over spines that felt like the ridges of ancient frozen reptiles. He felt the library breathing, a slow, dusty respiration that smelled of vanilla and old glue. Each book was a tombstone for a thought that had once been alive, a paper and ink monument to a moment that had passed through the hourglass and turned into dust. He found the shelf marked with the brass number 42, and there, nestled between a volume on the anatomy of a sigh and a treatise on the color of wind, was his own life, bound in a leather that felt suspiciously like the skin of his own palm. Barnaby the cat followed, his orange tail a flickering candle, wick in the gloom, his eyes reflecting the titles of books that shouldn't to exist. The sound of a falling tear, the architecture of a scream, the geometry of a lost afternoon. Adam pulled his book from the shelf, and the paper didn't just smell of ink. It smelled of the first rain of September and the ozone of a blown fuse. The heavy velvet curtain of the quiet in the library was not empty. It was a pressurized thing, a vacant room that was actually crowded with the ghosts of words that had never been spoken. As Adam opened his book to the blank pages of Chapter 7, the starlight began to curdle, turning the color of a bruised plum, and the mahogany shelves started to stretch and groan like the ribs of a sinking ship. From the shadows between the books, a sound emerged. Not a voice, but the rhythmic metallic rasp of a file against a steel tooth. The whisperer had found the frequency of the library. The chrome mask of the slasher didn't appear this time. Instead, the very text on the pages began to rise, the letters detaching themselves from the paper to form a swirling black swarm of iron, filings in the air. The words target, whisperer appeared on every spine in the aisle, a red ink contagion that turned the library into a catalogue of a single, lethal obsession. Adam felt a cold, electric shiver crawl up his spine, a sensation like 1,000 tiny needles stitching a map of fear into his skin. Source, Informant. The books hissed in a dry paper, cut chorus, their covers flapping like the wings of leather bats. Adam clutched his volume to his chest, feeling the green code beneath his skin throb in time with the mechanical rasp. The swarm of letters began to coalesce, forming a jagged, shifting shape that resembled a man made of knives and punctuation marks. This was the slasher in his true abstract form, a creature of syntax and sharp edges, a grammarian of the grave. The slasher shape was more than a threat. It was a cancellation, a giant ink black delete key that was moving toward the document of Adam's life. The air around the creature hummed with the sound of 1,000 paper. Shredders, a mechanical mastication that promised to turn the universe into a blizzard of meaningless scraps. He didn't use a blade. He used the sharp, pointed serifs of the alphabet to slice through the air, leaving behind thin black gashes that leaked the white, blinding light of the void. Adam backed away, his heels hitting a pedestal where a glass jar held a single, preserved heartbeat. The slasher shape lunged, its body a blurring flurry of X, S, and KS, a lethal crossword puzzle coming to life in the indigo gloom. Barnaby erupted, a golden comet of fur and fury, leaping through the swarm of letters and scattering them like soot in a storm. The cat, his jade, monitor eyes projected a beam of raw, unedited data that turned the iron, filing letters into soft, harmless puffs of dandelion down. Adam saw his chance and ran toward the arched window at the end of the aisle, where the silver moon hung like a target. The library was dissolving now, the books turning into a rain of dry leaves. the shelves becoming the bony, thin branches of an autumn forest that had never known a spring. He reached the glass and didn't break it. He dissolved through it, his body becoming a liquid melody of light and ink. He fell again, but this time he was falling upward toward the porcelain moon, his heart a ticking clock that was finally, mercifully, beginning to wind down. He could see the library shrinking below him, a small square lantern of knowledge lost in the vast, black ocean of the night, until it was nothing more than a spark, and then a memory. He landed on a surface that was as cold and smooth as a billiard ball, a vast white plain that stretched out under a sky of infinite velvet black. He was on the moon, but it wasn't tea to rock, it was a giant unwritten page, and he was the ink. The slasher was there, too, a silhouette of chrome standing at the edge of a crater that looked like a giant, open eye. The Whisperer held his long needle, blade toward the stars, and the stars began to blink out one by one as if they were being deleted from the sky. Adam looked at Barnaby, who was now a statue of orange glass, and he knew that the final broadcast was about to begin. The air tasted of salt and the end of the world, a sharp electric tang that made his teeth ache with the vibration of 1 billion unspoken goodbyes. He stood on the white page of the moon, watching as the slasher began to carve the first letter of a final devastating sentence into the ground. The world was no longer a place of wood and stone, but a manuscript of terror, and Adam Robinson was the last word waiting to be written. He felt the coldness of the lunar page seep into his bones, a numbing indifference that promised a peace made of nothingness and ink. He looked up at the black sky, where the last star was flickering like a dying candle, and he prepared himself for the silence that would follow the final punctuation mark. The moon was a great, unblinking eye of white porcelain that didn't to watch so much as it dreamed in a language of salt and radio, static. Adam Robinson stood on that vast lunar page, his shadow a long black ink spill that refused to obey the geometry of the light, stretching out toward the horizon like a finger pointing at a crime. Beneath his feet, the surface was soft as a fresh, fallen snow of powdered bone, and every step he took left a footprint that filled instantly with a dark, bubbling liquid that smelled of old library paste and burnt rubber. The slasher was a silver needle sewing the dark together, his chrome mask a mirror for the entire universe, as loneliness, and as he carved a jagged line into the lunar crust, the ground did just part, it shrieked. It was the sound of 1,000 violins being snapped over a giantess knee. Adam felt his own skin beginning to change, the pores on his hands turning into tiny circular indentations like the keys of an ancient typewriter, his veins pulsing with the thick black urgency of a headline that had never been printed. He was becoming the medium, a human manuscript for a story that was being written in the sharp, cold strokes of a killer. Esblade, the slasher, Esblade bit deep, and from the wound in the moon page, a swarm of black moths erupted, each one a tiny scrap of a telegram sent from a forgotten war. Adam lunged for the statue of Barnaby, the orange cat who was now a frozen prism of ginger glass, reflecting the dying stars in a kaleidoscope of amber and gold. He didn't gently touch the feline. He struck him with the force of a man trying to break a window into heaven. The glass shattered with a sound like a choir of crystal bells, and instead of shards, a spray of liquid sunlight filled the air, a warm golden mist that smelled of cinnamon and the fur of a cat sleeping in a sunbeam. The mist didn't dissipate. It coiled around Adam as arms, turning the green code of the source, Informant, into a roaring golden fire that burned away the paper. Thin fragility of his nerves. He felt a sudden, violent strength, a surge of feline grace that made the lunar gravity feel like a suggestion rather than a law. The slasher paused, his chrome mask flickering with the reflection of the golden fire, his blade vibrating with a low, mournful hum that sounded like a funeral march played on a saw. With a movement that was more a jump, cut in time than a physical stride, the slasher closed the distance between them, the target, Whisperer, finding its mark in the center of Adam. The blade didn't pierce his skin. It slid into his heart as if his body were made of smoke, and Adam felt a sensation like a mouthful of rusted nails and the cold electric shock of a winter lake. He didn't die. Instead, he saw the number 42 appearing in the air between them, a giant, burning brand that cast a light the color of a dying pomegranate. The slasher, Esblade, was a conductor, Esbaton, and as it twisted inside Adam's chest, the moon began to tear. The white porcelain surface buckled and ripped, revealing that it was only a thin, fragile skin stretched over the skeletal framework of the house at number 42. They weren't on the moon at all. They were standing on the peak of the roof, and the stars were merely the sparks from a chimney that had been burning for 1,000 years. The world around them was vacant, a hollow stage where the scenery had been stripped away to reveal the raw, unpainted wood of reality. The slasher leaned in, his mask inches from Adam's own face, and for the first time, the killer's voice emerged not from the air, but from the marrow of Adam's own teeth. It was a sound like dry leaves being crushed by a velvet boot. "The informant didn't send me to kill you, Adam," the house voice whispered, a sound of rust and old clocks. "The informant sent me to harvest the silence you've been keeping in the cellar of your soul." The blade in Adam's chest began to glow with a jaundiced phosphor light, and he felt his memories being pulled out through the wound. The smell of his grandfather's pipe, the sound of the rain on the attic window, the taste of a peach stolen from a neighbor's tree. Each memory was a silver thread being wound onto the slasher's blade, a spool of life being gathered by a mechanical weaver. Adam realized then that the Whisperer was a parasite of nostalgia, a creature that fed on the things we forget we remember, a silver-plated ghost of the things we've left behind in the dark. He grabbed the slasher's wrists, his fingers sinking into the chrome as if it were soft wax, and he began to push back. He didn't use muscle, he used the golden fire of the cat, spirit, the raw, unedited light of a life that lived entirely in the present moment. The house at number 42 began to groan, the shingles rattling like the scales of a dying dragon, and the chimneys started to weep a thick black soot that turned the air into a charcoal fog. The slasher's mask began to crack further, the silver tears streaming down the chrome and hissing as they hit the roof. Adam could see the void beneath the house now, a vast, swirling nebula of unwritten stories and half-formed dreams, a place where the gravity was made of regret and the light was made of hope. He realized that the only way to stop the broadcast was to become the signal himself, to drown out the Whisperer, ecstatic with the roar of his own existence. He felt his heart clock begin to tick with a new, fierce rhythm, a beat that didn't measure time but measured the intensity of the now. The slasher's blade began to melt, the silver mercury dripping onto the roof and burning holes through the slate. The killer's form was becoming less substantial, his sharp angles softening into the blurry lines of a smudge on a window pane. Adam pushed harder, his hands glowing with the brilliance of 1,000 suns, his voice a thunderous shout that tasted of ozone and fresh, turned earth. "I am not the target," he roared, and the sound shattered the remaining windows of the house, the glass falling away into the abyss like a rain of diamonds. The slasher let out a sound like a steam whistle screaming in a cathedral, his chrome body exploding into 1,000,000 tiny silver needles that flew outward and vanished into the charcoal fog. The pressure in Adam's chest vanished, leaving behind a warm, glowing hollow where the blade had been, a space that was no longer vacant, but filled with the humming energy of the golden fire. He stood on the roof, alone, as the house began to descend back through the layers of reality, falling toward the earth like a leaf in an October gale. He landed on the lawn with a soft, muffled thud, the house at number 42 looking once again like a discarded tooth on the edge of the town. The night was quiet, the only sound the rhythmic chirp of a cricket and the soft, distant hum of a television left on in a neighbor's house. Adam looked down at his hands and saw they were flesh again, but the lines on his palms were now written in a faint green script that glowed with the memory of the source. Barnaby the cat was sitting on the porch, his orange fur ruffled by the cool night breeze, his eyes back to their natural, curious yellow. He gave a soft, satisfied trill and began to wash a paw, as if the battle on the moon had been nothing more than a particularly vivid dream about a moth. Adam walked toward the front door, his feet crunching on the gravel, and he felt the weight of the house, his history pressing against him, no longer as a threat, but as a story that was finally ready to be told. He reached the door and paused, his hand on the brass knob. The wood felt warm, a living thing that breathed with the slow, steady pulse of a sleeping giant. He knew that the slasher wasn't gone forever, that the Whisperer was still out there in the static, waiting for the next vacant heart to call home. But for now, the broadcast was silent, the air was clear, and the story had reached a moment of rest. He opened the door and stepped inside, the smell of old newspapers and peaches greeting him like an old friend. The clocks in the hallway were all ticking in unison, a rhythmic, comforting heartbeat that told him he was home. He looked back at the lawn, where the number 42 was reflected in a puddle of rainwater, and he knew that the next chapter would be different. He closed the door, and the click of the latch was the final punctuation mark on a night that had seen the moon turn into a page and a man turn into a song. The house at number 42 was no longer a dwelling. It was a throat, and Adam Robinson was the scream trapped inside its velvet architecture. He stood in the foyer, but the floor was a tongue of red carpet that tasted of salt and the iron, scent of 1,000 old pennies, undulating with the slow, rhythmic digestion of a great wooden beast. The walls were not plaster, but layers of stiffened laundry, and telegraph wire, vibrating with the frantic, invisible pulse of the source, Informant. Every picture frame on the wall held not a photograph, but a mirror that showed Adam a different version of his own demise. One where he was made of glass, one where he was a bundle of dry tinder, and one where his eyes were replaced by the glowing vacuum tubes of an antique radio. Barnaby, the cat, was a golden spark of defiance in this fleshy cathedral, his tail a flickering candle, wick that cast a light the color of a ripening apricot. The air was vacant, not of life, but of the very atoms of oxygen replaced by the heavy sweet pressure of 1,000 rotting carnations and the ozone of a lightning strike caught in a mason jar. The hallway didn't just lead to the kitchen. It stretched like a strip of saltwater taffy pulled by an invisible giant hand, the distance between the rooms becoming a geography of impossible lengths. Adam walked, and his boots made the sound of a beetle, swing snapping against a window pane, a dry, brittle click that echoed through the ribs of the house. He realized then that he wasn't home, he was a signal being transmitted through the house, as wiring a human broadcast traveling toward an inevitable antenna. The target whisperer was no longer a name on a screen. It was the gravity of the building, a psychic weight that pulled at the marrow of his teeth and turned his thoughts into the static of a dead television channel. He reached for the doorknob of the parlor, and the brass was hot, a feverish sun that burned the green code of the informant deeper into his palm, branding him with the digital geometry of the hunt. The house groaned, a sound like a ship, as hull crushing against an iceberg of silence, and the ceiling began to weep a thick, black ink that smelled of old libraries and the sweat of a man who has forgotten his own name. Suddenly, the mirrors in the hallway shattered, not outward, but inward, sucking the light and the air into a million tiny silver maws. From the jagged frames emerged the slasher. But he was no longer a single man of chrome, he was a legion of sharp angles, a flurry of razor, wire that moved with the stuttering grace of a stop, motion film. The whisperer's mask was a mosaic of 1,000 broken watch, faces each one telling a different incorrect time, and in his hands he held a web of silver filament that shimmered with the texture of sun, bleached bone. He didn't T-strike, he wove. The silver wires lashed out, stitching the air around Adam, turning the hallway into a cage of shimmering lethal silk. Adam felt the wire graze his cheek, a sensation like the taste of copper, and the sound of wet parchment tearing, leaving behind a line of white fire that didn't bleed but hummed with a high-frequency vibration. He was being edited, his physical presence being trimmed and pruned by the slasher, as mechanical malice, his very existence becoming a rough draft in the killer's hands. Barnaby erupted into a sphere of orange electricity, his claws catching the silver filaments and turning them into showers of blue sparks that smelled of burnt sugar and wet dog. The cat was a grounding wire, a feline lightning rod that redirected the slasher's geometric violence into the floorboards. Adam lunged through a gap in the silver web, his body feeling as light as a dandelion seed, his heart a frantic metronome, beating out a rhythm of panic and ink. He burst into the parlor, but the room was a forest of vertical piano strings, a labyrinth of music and wire that stretched up into an infinite black sky. The slasher followed, his boots clicking with the precision of a guillotine, his blade, his body a shimmering blur of chrome and shadow. The whisperer began to pluck the strings of the room, and the sound wasn't tea music, it was the sound of Adam's own memories being played back as a funeral dirge, the creak of a porch swing, the whistle of a tea kettle, the final breath of a grandfather. The vibrations of the piano, string forest, began to liquefy the floor. The wood turning into a sea of dark, vibrating oil that tasted of bitter almonds and the coldness of a cellar floor. Adam struggled to stay upright, his hands grasping at the vibrating wires, the metal biting into his skin with a wonderful, terrible reality. He saw the core of the house now, a giant, glowing vacuum tube that sat in the center of the parlor like a glass heart. Inside the tube, the source, Informant flickered. A tiny trapped bird made of green lightning and copper mesh, its wings beating against the glass with the sound of 1,000 typewriter keys. The slasher moved toward the tube, his long needle, blade raised to shatter the glass and release the final, devastating broadcast that would turn the world into a vacant wasteland of static and soot. Adam realized that the whisperer wasn't just a killer, he was a janitor of the soul, sent to sweep away the mess of human experience and replace it with the clean, cold perfection of a dead signal. He scrambled through the oiled sea, his limbs feeling like heavy pistons, his breath a jagged sore of ozone and ginger. Fur. He reached the glass heart just as the slasher, as blade descended, a silver lightning rod aimed at the center of the green bird. Adam didn't use a weapon, he used the cat. He grabbed Barnaby, the feline, body a warm, vibrating battery of life, and thrust him against the vacuum tube. The contact was a tectonic event. The golden fire of the cat collided with the green lightning of the informant, and the parlor exploded into a symphony of color. The yellow of a summer sun, the violet of a bruised plum, the emerald of a secret forest. The slasher was thrown back, his chrome body fracturing into 1,000 silver needles that melted into the oil. See, like ice in a furnace, the vacuum tube didn't chatter. It dissolved, the green bird merging with the cat to form a new, brilliant creature of light and fur. The house at number 42 began to fold in on itself, the velvet throat of the architecture closing as the broadcast reached its crescendo. Adam felt himself being squeezed upward, his body a drop of ink being pushed through a fountain pen, his mind a whirlwind of every word he had ever spoken. He burst through the roof and into a night that was no longer black, but a vibrant, living tapestry of stars that smelled of wood smoke and the first frost of winter. He landed on the grass, the ground solid and real beneath his shaking hands, the house behind him standing silent and still in the moonlight. Barnaby sat on the porch, his fur glowing with a soft, iridescent sheen, his eyes reflecting the entire universe in a single curious blink. The slasher was gone, the silver wires were gone, and the target whisperer was finally mercifully off the air. Adam Robinson looked at his hands and saw that the green code was fading, replaced by the simple, warm texture of human skin. A blank page, ready for a new story to begin. The sun didn't rise. It was merely turned on by a giant, invisible switch that smelled of hot dust and old vacuum tubes. Adam Robinson stood on his lawn and watched the sun, which was a flat yellow disk of construction paper pasted against a sky the color of a faded denim jacket. The town was a stage, set after the actors had fled. The trees merely wooden struts supporting a canopy of painted silk that smelled of turpentine and old attic trunks. He walked toward the street, his footsteps making the hollow rhythmic thud of a drumstick hitting a theatrical floor. Every mailbox he passed was identical, each one bearing the same stenciled message in a font that looked like dripping black wax. Source Informant. There were no neighbors, no barking dogs, only the vast, echoing quiet of a world that had been edited down to a single terrifying paragraph. He looked at his own house, the Victorian beast at number 42, and saw that it was breathing with a slow tectonic heave, its windows blinking like the eyes of a giant, soot-stained owl. Barnaby the cat sat on the curb, his orange fur a singular, vibrant flame in a world that was rapidly turning into a charcoal sketch. The cat didn't too look at Adam. He looked at the space where the horizon should have been, where the blue of the sky was peeling away in long, dry strips to reveal the cold black machinery of the stars behind the curtain. Adam turned back to the house, the door of number 42 standing open like an invitation to a funeral he was expected to lead. He stepped over the threshold, and the foyer was no longer a room. It was the interior of a massive, brass-bellied clock, the gears the size of Ferris wheels turning with a groan that tasted of oil and ancient, sun-baked dust. The walls were lined with millions of tiny, glass-fronted drawers, each one containing a single fluttering heartbeat. This was the true archive, the repository of every pulse the Whisperer had ever harvested. Adam felt a tugging at his own chest, a magnetic pull toward an empty drawer labeled with his own name in a script that looked like a tangled web of copper wire. The air was vacant of scent, vacant of heat, vacant of everything but the high, pitched whistle of a radio frequency searching for a home. He reached for his drawer, his fingers turning into the thin silver needles of a compass, pointing toward the basement where the broadcast originated. From the shadows of the giant gears, the target whisperer emerged, but he was no longer a man or a simple slasher. He was a symphony of sharp, chrome-plated geometry, a walking constellation of razor blades and broken mirrors. He didn't carry a knife. His entire body was a weapon, a shimmering, razor-edged sculpture that cut the very air into ribbons of black static. The Whisperer moved with the grace of a falling star, his chrome mask reflecting not Adam as face, but the entire history of the house at 42, the fires, the births, the long, silent winters. He lunged, and the sound wasn't a scream. It was the sound of 1,000 typewriter carriages returning at once, a violent mechanical clatter that shook the brass floor. Adam dodged, his body feeling like a collection of loose springs and velvet stuffing, his movements guided by the frantic, green, monitor glow of Barnaby, sighs in the dark. The cat leaped onto a rotating gear, his orange fur casting a spray of sparks that turned the brass room into a carnival of golden shadow. The Whisperer, as silver blades hissed as they sliced through the air, parting the fabric of reality to reveal the white, humming void that lay beneath the floorboards. Adam realized the final truth as he stood at the edge of the abyss. He wasn't the victim of the story, he was the ink. He grabbed a handful of the black static leaking from the air and threw it at the Whisperer, the darkness sticking to the chrome like a thick bubbling tar. The slasher, as geometric form began to blur, the sharp edges softening into the rounded, messy curves of a human signature. The cat, Barnaby, became a bridge of light, his body stretching from the brass gears to Adam's heart, a golden conduit for the final broadcast. Adam didn't fight the Whisperer, he wrote him out of existence. He imagined the slasher as a word on a page, and then he imagined a giant, celestial eraser moving across the sky. The chrome mask shattered, not into shards, but into a cloud of white butterflies that smelled of peppermint and fresh, cut grass. The house at 42 began to spin, a carousel of time and space that dissolved into a flurry of snow and old newspaper clippings. Adam felt himself becoming part of the wind, a long melodic sentence that traveled across the rooftops of the world, carrying the scent of autumn and the promise of a long, peaceful sleep. The world didn't end with a bang or a whimper. It ended with the sound of a book being closed and placed on a high, dust-covered shelf. Adam Robinson was no longer a man on a lawn. He was the memory of a summer afternoon, a ghost in the wiring of a house that had finally finished its long, terrifying story. Barnaby the cat walked through the remains of the house, his paws making no sound on the white, silent floor of the universe, his tail a flickering orange flame that would never go out. The mailbox labeled Source, Informant stood alone in the middle of a vast, indigo field of carnations, its red flag raised to signal that the message had been delivered. The stars above were no longer radio towers, they were just stars, cold and bright, and indifferent to the clockwork dramas of men. The broadcast was over, the signal was dead, and the silence that followed was as sweet as a peach plucked from a tree in the middle of a dream that had finally, mercifully, come to an end.